Great. Well, thank you everyone for joining us. Again, if you need any assistance with Zoom, please contact us by using that chat button. And we're going to go ahead and get started with a few introductory slides. First, I'd like to say thank you to today's sponsors, AbbVie, Accorda, Amneal, Boston Scientific, Kiowa Kern, and Lundbeck. And a special thank you to today's silver sponsor, Synovian. To learn more about these companies and resources they offer to the Parkinson's community, including detailed product information, please visit our virtual exhibit hall located at theparkinson.org/Minnesota-Dakotas/chapter-supports. When you visit this page, all you need to do is click on the sponsor's logo to find out more information. As many of you have joined our virtual programs before, we may have some new attendees, and I'd like to share a bit of information about the foundation. The mission of the Parkinson's Foundation is to make lives better for people living with Parkinson's disease by improving care and advancing research today until there's a tomorrow without the disease. In everything we do, we build on the energy, experience, and passion of the global Parkinson's community. We provide free resources, including our website, parkinson.org, educational book series, webinars, podcasts, our hospital safety kit called the Aware and Care Kit, and our toll-free helpline 1-800-4PD-INFO, which is staffed by Parkinson's specialists. We also have a weekly webinar you can find at parkinson.org/PDHealth. We invest more than $10 million annually to support the most talented minds in research to explore what causes Parkinson's, how to treat it, and ultimately how to cure it. We have launched a very exciting initiative called PD Generation, which provides free genetic testing and counseling to those with Parkinson's diagnosis. After a successful pilot program, we are thrilled to announce that PD Generation study has launched its next step, a genetic test that can be completed at home. Now more than ever, we know that having an at-home option is vital to reaching people with Parkinson's. Participants of this study can now submit their test using an at-home kit and review their results with a genetic counselor virtually. To learn more and to get further information, please visit parkinson.org/PDGeneration. And as we get started with our program, a reminder to submit those questions by clicking the chat icon and type your question. We will do our very best to get to all the questions that are submitted, but we did have a lot, so we will truly try our best. All right, now it is my pleasure to welcome our speaker, Dr. Martha Nance, Medical Director at Struthers Parkinson Center in Golden Valley, Minnesota, Parkinson's Foundation Center of Excellence. Dr. Nance went to Yale University and Virginia Commonwealth University before making her way to Minnesota for her neurology training in the mid-1980s. And she has been here ever since. She has been the medical director of Struthers Parkinson Center since 2000. Thank you so much, Dr. Nance, for joining us. And feel free to get started by sharing your slides.
It's always the hardest part for me. All right, hopefully you can see my slides. All right.
Yes, looks perfect.
Yeah. So first, I thank you for inviting me to speak, and thank you so many people for getting up nice and early on Thursday to watch. And the good news is that it's also being recorded, so people can review later or look at it later or share it with your friends. So I am going to be talking about medications. I want to just say first, I don't have any financial stake in any of the companies whose medications I'll be talking about. We're also always supposed to answer or tell people whether we are discussing off-label uses of medications. There's, what the medication was approved by the FDA to treat, and then there's using it for things that are slightly off of what the FDA approval was. And there aren't that many medications approved specifically for treating such and such a symptom in Parkinson's disease. So I may be discussing off-label uses of certain medications. If there's one point I want to leave you with at the end of this, and hopefully I won't talk for too long because I know there are many questions. There are really a dizzying array of options for treating Parkinson's now. And so it really, the science kind of meets art in the clinic exam room. There's science behind all the treatments we use, but each patient is so unique and the symptoms that they have are unique and the response to medications is different. So it really becomes an art of managing the disease. I'm just going to talk, just sort of rehearse what the quote Parkinson medicines are and sort of what's new for quote Parkinson's medicines. When we say Parkinson's medicine, we're mostly talking about drugs that we think should be treating those primary movement related symptoms of Parkinson's, or the stiffness, the slowness, the posture changes, the difficulty getting started. We'll talk in a few slides about, there's a whole long list of other symptoms that people with Parkinson's can have for which there are also treatments. But when we talk about Parkinson medicine, we talk about things to treat the movement symptoms. And the number one drug for Parkinson's is and always will be levodopa. I've decided to put some of these little chemical structures up on the screen just for fun today. So that's levodopa over on the left-hand side of the screen. When you put levodopa in the stomach, it goes up to the brain and it gets converted in one quick step to dopamine, which is the chemical that's missing. The enzyme that does that conversion is sometimes called dopa decarboxylase, or sometimes it's called aromatic acid decarboxylase, or AADC. I mention that because it'll come up later. So one enzyme called AADC is sort of the last step in creating dopamine in the brain. Because the brain cells are sick in Parkinson's, they're not functioning very well, they're not making dopamine very well. But we know from many, many years, 50 years of experience, that if you take levodopa, it helps, at least to a certain extent, to replace that dopamine that's missing. In the US, levodopa is combined with another drug called carbidopa within the pill. The carbidopa doesn't treat the Parkinson's. The carbidopa is just there to reduce the nausea that some people get when they levodopa. So your pill bottle will always say carbidopa, levodopa, 10-100 or 25-100. Now what's confusing about levodopa is that there are any number of forms of levodopa. There's immediate release levodopa, there's extended or controlled release levodopa. There's a drug called Rytary, which is a capsule form that combines both immediate and extended release levodopa. New a few years ago was Duopa, which is a continuous intestinal infusion of levodopa. And then the newest available form of levodopa is an inhaled form called Inbrija. That's commonly used as sort of a rescue treatment. So if you're out at Home Depot and suddenly realize you forgot your medicine and you're going off, then you might take an inhaled form of levodopa. We don't think of that as replacing the usual pill forms. And the new thing, I just actually saw this in one of my medical journals over the weekend, was the results of what they call a phase 1 trial, a safety trial of a new version of levodopa that is given as a continuous under the skin subcutaneous infusion. And they call it a prodrug because it's not actually levodopa. It's got an extra molecule on it, so they call it phoslevodopa. And that makes it a little bit more stable and sort of easier to get into the system. And the treatment was given to 20 patients for 28 days, and they all did okay with the treatment. And they seem to have less off time, particularly in the mornings. And so that's going to lead to a phase 2 trial. It is not a drug that's available on the shelves today, but just so you know that even though we've got all these different forms of levodopa already, they're still working on newer, better versions of the drug. Probably the second best drugs as a group for treating the motor symptoms of Parkinson's are the group of drugs called the Dopa agonists. And that includes pramipexole, ropinirole, rotigotine, which comes in the form of a skin patch, and then another drug called apomorphine. That's the chemical structure of apomorphine on the side there. And the new thing that really just was approved earlier this year and is just now hitting the pharmacy shelves is a under the tongue version of apomorphine. Apomorphine has been available for a number of years as a injection that you give yourself under the skin. So again, the idea that you're in the, you're outside somewhere and realize suddenly you're off and can't move very well. And so you go get your syringe and dial it up and give yourself an injection. That was a very difficult drug, I think, for patients to use. Much easier to put a little breath strip kind of thing under the tongue. So we'll see. I don't think I've actually had any patients successfully get access to the drug yet to see how it's working for them. We did participate in the research study that helped bring that drug to market, and patients, I think, were thankful for a under the tongue form of the drug, and it does seem to kick in a little bit more quickly. There are a whole host of other Parkinson medications, including the MAO inhibitors, selegiline, rasagiline, and sulfinamide, the COMT inhibitors, entacapone, and then the sort of drug that's in a category by itself called amantadine. MAO inhibitors and COMT inhibitors increase the amount of dopamine in the brain by preventing it from being broken down once it's already there. They're not as strong or as effective in treating Parkinson's, but we often use them as an adjunct, sort of an add-on to levodopa. And some doctors will also use these drugs as initial treatment. So maybe you don't need a heavy-duty drug when your symptoms are quite mild. Let's use a mild drug when your symptoms are mild and save the levodopa or the dopa agonist for later. So selegiline, rasagiline, sulfinamide are the MAO inhibitors. What's new is there's a new COMT inhibitor called opicapone, which is really fun to say. Again, we'll see how well it works. It's how it works in the brain is similar to the old and available drug called entacapone, but the difference is opicapone is given once a day. So it's more convenient. And again, that one is just beginning to hit the shelves, and I'm not sure I've actually had any patients taking it yet. A couple of years ago, amantadine came out in the form of a once-a-day pill called Gocovri, and I think there may be a few folks on the line who are taking that drug. I often use amantadine in sort of the early mid stages of Parkinson's when people are starting to have off times and dyskinesia, and you can't just keep giving more and more levodopa. But amantadine sometimes simmers down both the dyskinesia while at the same time helping the off times. And the once a day amantadine obviously would give somebody coverage through a 24-hour period, which is kind of nice. And then the other thing that's new is a drug called istradefylline, or the trade name is Nurians. And that's probably been available maybe 6 or 8 months that it's sort of been on the shelves. And that's also a once a day drug that works in a completely different way. The chemicals it works on in the brain are different from dopamine or any of the other sort of receptors in the brain that we think we want to affect. So it's called an adenosine receptor antagonist. And that is sort of thought to be an indirect way to try to help with the off times. So Nurians is not used as initial therapy. It's used as add-on therapy for people who have, 2 or 3 or 4 hours of off time during the day. And it was shown to reduce that off time by something like 25%. So that's another drug that's new. So now we've got different forms of levodopa, a new form of apomorphine, and then two new drugs in this sort of other category. Then there's medications for all the other symptoms of Parkinson's disease. So starting kind of at the top, things that go on in the brain that clearly are frequent in Parkinson's, maybe caused by Parkinson's disease. Cognitive changes, now that people live for decades after a diagnosis of Parkinson's, some people live on to have more than just movement related symptoms. The disease starts to affect parts of the brain that don't have to do with movement, and that levodopa doesn't help. So changes in thinking and memory. There are not any drugs to treat cognition that are specific for Parkinson's disease. There are several drugs on the market to treat cognitive changes in Alzheimer's disease, and we do borrow those pills frequently in the Parkinson's clinic. So this is one of those situations where I'm talking about sort of an off-label use of a drug that's approved for a different purpose. I guess I justify it by saying, who knows that whether my 85-year-old person with Parkinson's disease doesn't also have a little touch of Alzheimer's disease brewing? And is the change in cognition specifically completely due to Parkinson's, or do they have other things happening too? And so we do use these quote Alzheimer drugs. Donepezil is one of them, rivastigmine, memantine. So we do use these drugs sometimes to try to help people with cognition. Depression is pretty common in people with Parkinson's. It's pretty common in people who don't have Parkinson's. And there's not a specific antidepressant that we do or don't use because of a diagnosis of Parkinson's. We often select antidepressants based on whatever side effects you either want or don't want to have. So some depressed people sleep all day long and can't get out of bed. And for those people, you might use what we think of as an activating antidepressant. Other people who are depressed lie awake all night, ruminating and worrying and anxious and can't sleep and can't rest. For those people, you might use a more sedating antidepressant that you would use at bedtime to try to help you kind of simmer down for sleep. Speaking of anxiety, anxiety is, again, quite common in people with Parkinson's. For brief moments of anxiety, I think we often use basically anxiety pills like alprazolam or Xanax, the same pill that an actor might use before they go out on stage to try and simmer down their stage fright. But for people who have anxiety all day, every day, we really don't want to be using a short-acting anxiety pill like alprazolam 5 times a day. So we often end up using some of those more calming antidepressants to simmer down anxiety. Hallucinations, I think, have become much more well-known in Parkinson's since the advent of the drug pimavanserin, which there's been a lot of marketing of that drug on TV. The advertising, I think, has been both good and bad. I think it has allowed people with Parkinson's who have hallucinations to feel that they're permitted to talk about it. I think for a patient who's diagnosed with Parkinson's yesterday, that those advertisements are kind of frightening. How to determine what % of people with Parkinson's have hallucinations, that's really hard to sort out, because you have to figure out what the denominator is. If you actually include every single person with Parkinson's disease, if we added up everybody who currently has Parkinson's in the country and said, do you today have hallucinations? I think the number would be fairly small. If you say, well, if you follow somebody from beginning to end till death who has Parkinson's, how many of those people develop hallucinations at some point, the number may be a little bit higher. But at any rate, there is a drug that is specifically approved to treat hallucinations in Parkinson's disease, and that's this drug called pimavanserin, or the trade name is Nuplazid. We do use that drug. We also do sometimes use other hallucination drugs that have not specifically been proven effective in Parkinson's, but are commonly used, for instance, in older people. There are many older people who don't have Parkinson's who may have hallucinations or kind of paranoid thinking or suspicious thinking. And the geriatric specialists will often use a low dose of a drug called quetiapine, or they might use a low dose of a drug called risperidone to kind of simmer that thinking process, those sort of thinking processes that are a little off the track, to try and bring things back in better control. And then sleep, there are many ways that sleep can be affected in Parkinson's, some of which are related to Parkinson's, some of which aren't. There's REM behavior disorder, restless leg syndrome. There's waking up because you need to go to the bathroom. There's waking up because your tremor comes back when your Parkinson medicine runs out. So sleep in Parkinson's is kind of complicated and needs to be, there needs to be kind of a detailed history of what exactly is going on with sleep before you determine what medication to use. And then, so those are all sort of brain or mood or those sorts of things. And then there's below the neck, bowel dysfunction, overactive bladder, low blood pressure, dry eyes, dry mouth. There are all sorts of medications available as well to treat these symptoms, all of which are quite common in people with Parkinson's. So don't be shy about talking to your doctor about those kind of symptoms. And whether it's the Parkinson's doctor or the primary care doctor, these kind of symptoms are often shared by the neurologist and the primary care doc. Some primary care docs defer to the neurologist, some neurologists defer to the primary care doctor to address these symptoms. And again, none of these drugs are specifically approved to treat these symptoms in people with Parkinson's disease. But I'll just call out a couple of names of drugs. So mirabegron is a newer drug for overactive bladder that, unlike all of the other drugs for overactive bladder, this one works in a chemically different way. All of the other drugs are anticholinergic drugs. And anticholinergic is kind of a dirty word in Parkinson's. Anything that has anticholinergic effects can cause constipation, low blood pressure, confusion, and trouble starting the urine. Those are all bad symptoms to have and symptoms that many of our patients already have. Mirabegron, because it works chemically in a different way, is less likely to have those effects. In fact, if anything, tends to raise the blood pressure. And then there are a number of drugs we use to treat the low blood pressure that often occurs when people stand up, the symptom that we call orthostatic hypotension. But there's one drug in particular that has been approved to treat orthostatic hypotension in Parkinson's disease, which is called droxidopa or Northera. So we do sometimes use that drug as well. So a number of symptoms people can have and a number of treatments for these symptoms. Don't be shy about talking to your doctor about these symptoms. Sometimes these non-motor symptoms are more disturbing to a patient than whether they have tremor or whether they shuffle a little bit when they walk. So don't be shy about talking to the doctor about them. And then there's, what else might you take? So patients often ask about vitamins. I think there are some questions about that. We can talk about it more. Many doctors will suggest, and some will more firmly suggest than others, that patients taking levodopa should take a folic acid supplement or perhaps a B complex vitamin. We do use up the B vitamins as we metabolize the levodopa. That's a big dose of levodopa in a pill. And so your body has to handle that drug. And you use up folic acid as you metabolize the drug. So you can respond to that or show that you're aware of that by taking a little bit of extra folic acid. It's not hard to do, it's inexpensive. Do you really need it? I kind of waffle about that because I think they put extra folic acid in your orange juice and your bread and everything else. But I think it's easy enough to take a B complex vitamin. It's important to address bone health. People with Parkinson's either are already at an age or are heading into an age where bone health becomes a concern anyway. Are bones thin with age? Women in particular should certainly, if you're diagnosed with Parkinson's, you're over 60 and you're female, you should have a bone density test and use whatever treatment is appropriate to treat the bone health. And that, as a neurologist, I usually deflect that or defer to the primary care doctor, or at Park Nicollet, we actually have a wonderful bone health program that we can now refer people to. It's important also not to neglect your other management of other health issues. People with Parkinson's live for decades, 10 years, 20 years, 30 years. And the whole point of it is to live as well as you can during that period of time. So get your flu shot, get your shingles vaccine, get your coronavirus vaccine when they become available. Get your screening tests for your, for breast cancer, colon cancer, and so on as appropriate for your age and your general health history. I just want to spend a couple minutes talking about things that are in the works. What really everybody wants, and it's been a frustrating career for me because we haven't gotten there yet. What everybody wants is a treatment that actually addresses the disease process. It's all fine and well to treat symptoms, but we have yet to find any drug that actually slows down the course of Parkinson's or reverses it or stops it. A couple things that people are talking about are treatments addressing a protein in the cells called synuclein. You've probably heard or may be familiar that if you look at the brain cells in people with Parkinson's disease, the brain cells that are sick, they have a blob inside of them that we call a Lewy body. And that Lewy body is filled with a protein called synuclein. So it seems like your brain cells collect, if you want to think of it this way, trash over decades. And in particular, this synuclein protein seems to accumulate in the cell. It has difficulty kind of dumping out the trash. At my house, it's newspapers that seem to accumulate in the house because, somebody wants to read this article and somebody reads that one, and pretty soon the newspapers are stacked up and falling off the table onto the floor. And how do you clean out the trash? And so there are a number of approaches being looked at, antibodies to that synuclein that will sort of stick to it and pull it out of the cells. There's actually an oral medication, the one down at the bottom of the screen, I don't even know how to pronounce it, Anli 138B, that actually is said to dissolve that synuclein. That sounds good, except you got to be a little careful. The kinds of chemicals that dissolve proteins you might call, bleach. So you have to be a little careful. Does that drug that you're using only dissolve the synuclein protein, or does it affect other proteins in the cells as well that you don't want to have dissolved? So far, things are looking good for a number of these treatments. Of course, the initial studies of any new drug are simply looking at safety. So whenever you see that a drug has gone through a phase 1 trial, that means they're just looking at 20 people to see if they can survive taking this drug for a short period of time. And they look at everything from EKGs to liver function to kidney function to what's the peak dose in the body and how long does it last in the body and how is it excreted and all kinds of safety issues before you even get to the point of doing a bigger study to determine whether it actually does what you hope it does to help patients. So the one at the top of the page, the cinpanemab, is now engaged in a phase 2 trial, which is that bigger study to see if it actually helps people. So stay tuned for that. There are a number of other companies working on antibody treatments to synuclein as well. And then there was great enthusiasm a while back about, we got oodles of drugs sitting. I mean, their drug companies have essentially libraries of different chemicals sitting on the shelves. And there are all kinds of drugs that have been approved to treat, anything from diabetes to cancer. And why not try these drugs and see if they happen to do anything for Parkinson's disease? And several drugs that have been looked at. One is a drug called nilotinib, which was a cancer drug that had surprisingly good results in a what we call an open label trial, where they just gave it to 10 people and all 10 people felt better. And that gives you hope to go on to a bigger study. But the phase 2 trials, there are 2 different phase 2 trials done, and they really got conflicting results, neither one of which was earth-shattering. So it really does not look like nilotinib is going to make the cut when you actually do a scientific study of the drug. Similarly, isradipine is an old blood pressure drug that's been out for a while that looked promising, but the trial of that drug was actually did not show any slowing of progression of the disease in a large phase 2 trial. Inosine is another drug that's out there on the market for other purposes that actually raises the uric acid level in the body. And a study was done many years ago that just happened to show they were studying something completely different, but it showed that people with Parkinson's who had a higher uric acid level seemed to have slower progression of their Parkinson's. Well, here's a drug that raises the uric acid level. Might that help people to slow their disease? And that trial was actually stopped early because even just partway through the study, they could tell that it was not going to work. And then there's a diabetes drug called exenatide, for which there's a phase 3 trial underway currently. So there's been some enthusiasm about some of these repurposed drugs that kind of didn't pan out. But the idea isn't a bad one. It certainly is easier to take a drug that's already there, for which you have safety data, people can tolerate the drug and what doses seem to be helpful. And then you can just study it now in people with Parkinson's disease. So it's a relatively easier thing to get an answer fairly quickly. So, and then the final thing I'm going to mention, and I've talked for too long already, is gene therapy trials. So this is, remember where I said that way back at the first slide, the levodopa that you take in your pill gets turned into dopamine, and the enzyme that does that is an enzyme called dopa decarboxylase, or sometimes they call it AADC. We run into the problem as Parkinson's goes on that we can give people oodles of levodopa, and doubling the levodopa dose doesn't anymore seem to give you double the results. Why is that? Well, it may be as those brain cells are getting sicker that even if you supply them with levodopa, those cells are no longer able to turn the levodopa into dopamine. That they're missing, they don't have enough of that AADC enzyme to actually make that last step. So you can take all the levodopa pills you want and it still isn't going to help. So people are doing studies of actually putting a gene that encodes that enzyme by a surgical infusion into the brain. So you have to hook that gene to a virus. When you hear about gene therapy, we often hook the gene of interest to a virus. Think of the virus as just being a microscopic syringe. So what viruses know how to do that we don't is they know how to inject genes into cells. That's how they make you sick. You inhale a virus, and that virus sticks to your cells and injects its own DNA into your cell, and that takes over the cell's machinery, and then you cough and get a runny nose or whatever symptoms it might be. So you need a virus that different viruses like to attach to different kinds of cells in the body. So for instance, the coronavirus that's causing so much pain and suffering around the world does not particularly seem to go to the brain. You have to use a different virus to get a gene into brain cells. And so they use a virus called AAV. So at the top of the slide, the compound that they're actually injecting into the brain is AAV number 2, with the AADC gene attached to it, and they do a surgical infusion of that into the brain cells to try and increase the function of that, or the amount of that enzyme available, so that the cell can make its own dopamine, or more effectively use the levodopa that we're providing. Other gene therapy studies have looked at things like nerve growth factors and other enzymes, other dopamine supporting treatments. And so that's a whole exploding area of research, is what genes can we put into the body to replace functions that are not working properly. And then I these days I'm doing a commercial for PD generation, and thank you, Erin already did it for me earlier, but there's also the idea that we now think that maybe 10% of people with Parkinson's have an identifiable genetic cause for their Parkinson's. PD generation is looking at 7 different, quote, Parkinson's genes. For 2 of these 7 genes, called GBA and LRRK2, there are treatments, it's not treatments, I should have said treatment trials, research studies of treatments specific for that gene are underway. So enzyme replacement therapy has been proposed for GBA and is under research studies. The LRRK2 mutations that cause Parkinson's actually cause the gene to be overactive. And so they're looking at treatments to turn down or turn off the enzyme that's being overproduced in those patients. So now, particularly if you have a family history of Parkinson's or a younger onset of Parkinson's, those are things that might make you think you're more likely to have a genetic form of Parkinson's. And there may be a research study of a treatment specific for that genetic form of the disease that would be available to you. So I think I'll end there and start taking some questions. We actually had any number of questions even before people submitted, even before I started talking. And I'll just run through some of these. Some of them are quick and some of them, I'm sort of long-winded. I could take a whole hour to answer some of these questions, each one. What is the maximum number of carbidopa, levodopa 25-100 pills that you can take in a day? There really is no specified limit. There are practical limits. I have some patients who can't take more than half a pill twice a day without getting sick to their stomach. I have other patients who take 40 of those pills in a day. They may take 5 of them every 3 hours, 8 times a day, because that's what they need to fill up their tank. And so the next question is 9 pills of carbidopa, levodopa too much per day? Only if it's too much for you. So how do you know how much is enough? The whole goal of these pills is to help you live your life. And what we think they do is simmer down your tremor and help you move more easily. So what I usually say is all we're trying to do is help you shake less and move better for the next few hours. And however many pills you need to do that, that's how many pills you take, and however long it lasts, that's how often you take your pills. There's no reason to take 4 pills at a time if 3 pills at a time works. And people get into practical limits. So the dyskinesia, the fidgety, wiggly movements that people get are caused by the pills. And so if you're taking 1 levodopa pill 4 times a day, and every time you take the pill, you get the wiggles, that kind of tells you you're sort of hitting the limit as to how much levodopa you can tolerate. And so taking 1.5 pills or 2 pills at a time it's just gonna give you more dyskinesia. What about peak dose dystonia, which is sort of related to peak dose dyskinesia. So here I have Parkinson's and I can't move. So I take my Parkinson pill and whoa, half an hour later it kicks in and now I move too much and actually I get dystonia, sort of a cramping, twisting, tight movement rather than just a flowing, free movement. The usual solution to that would be take smaller doses of levodopa sometimes you need it more often to cover the off times that tend to also occur. And that's also a situation where we would often throw in other drugs. So rather than levodopa, and more levodopa, let's add amantadine, let's try istradefylline, let's use a dopa agonist and see whether other drugs can be helpful. How do you know when to start levodopa? Again, the whole point of levodopa is to help you shake less and move better. But the real point of it is to help you live your life. And if you are currently doing everything you ever wanted to do, and yes, I've got a little bit of left-hand tremor, but it doesn't really get in the way of anything. And the doctor told me yesterday that I must have Parkinson's, but I don't, I'm right-handed. I don't do anything with my left hand anyway, and I'm not limited in what I'm doing. Well, you may not need treatment. On the other hand, if you are not able to, you're working on the factory line and you can't work as fast as you used to, or you're retired, but it takes you twice as long to get dressed in the morning, and that's really annoying. And it's hard for you to get your shirt buttoned because you just can't move your fingers well enough. Well, then maybe you need to start some treatment. Does levodopa cause movement issues? We talked about the dyskinesia. Somebody wrote, years ago, I heard that people sometimes take a Cinemet vacation. Cinemet is the old trade name for the original brand of carbidopa levodopa. And yes, indeed, we used to put people in the hospital for a week and do what we called a holiday, a drug holiday. It was pretty dangerous to do, and you shouldn't try this at home alone. You could actually, if you are accustomed to taking 12 or 15 levodopa pills a day and you suddenly stop taking levodopa, please don't do that. That could be fatal. You can develop a condition called neuroleptic malignant syndrome if you suddenly cut off your supply of dopamine. So don't do that at home. We don't really do drug holidays in that sense anymore because it's so hard on the patient. You have to expect that you're really not going to be able to move very well at all when you're down or off your medicine. I do sometimes have people who seem to drift into taking bigger and bigger and bigger doses of levodopa. And we get into the opposite situation where it almost feels like the people are, I hate to use the word addiction, but they can't stand for a moment that feeling you get as the levodopa is wearing off. And so they want more. And then and 2 pills used to work, but now I need 3. And then, oh boy, I need it after 3 hours because I just feel so terrible inside when it starts to wear off. We try to look for some kind of movement related symptoms. Are you stiff? Are you slow? Does your tremor? And try to remind ourselves that we mostly use levodopa to treat movement related symptoms. I saw somebody asked about restasis for dry eye. And yeah, dry eyes are very common in people with Parkinson's, partly because you don't blink as often. And if you don't blink as often, the eyes are going to get dry and then they start to tear. So our patients will often complain of both tearing too much and dry eye. So how do you combat that? Use, eye drops, 18 times a day if you need to, whatever you need to keep those eyes moist. Some people use a little eye patch thing at night so that your eyes are really nicely closed at night. Another thing for the dry eye in the morning, to just get a nice hot, wet washcloth to put over your eyes. And it feels so good. And it kind of loosens up the pores. You actually have little oil glands in your eyelids that are supposed to secrete a little bit of oil over top of your tears to keep them from evaporating. And if those oil ducts get plugged up because your eyes are so dry, then they can't secrete that oil. And if you just heat it up a little bit, put a nice hot washcloth on there, it sort of melts that plug of wax in the oil glands and actually helps in more than one way. So yes, go ahead and use Restasis or other. You don't You don't want to use, get the read out Visine kind of drops that have chemicals in them, but just the sort of liquid tears. Best medications for depression, as I mentioned, there's not a specific drug that we use because somebody has Parkinson's. It depends on whether you're an anxious, depressed person or a sort of apathetic, lay in bed with the covers over your head depressed person. Do we use an activating antidepressant or a kind of sedating antidepressant or one of each? We mentioned the drugs to help with hallucinations, the pimavanserin or Nuplazid, pretty easy to use. It's a once a day. There's basically one dose, and that's however well it works, that's how well it works. We do often use other hallucination drugs that are not specifically approved for use in Parkinson's disease, but sometimes are helpful. Do certain sleeping pills cause dreams that seem very, very real? Certainly, many people with Parkinson's have very vivid dreams. The more we give Parkinson pills late in the day, if you take a bunch of Levodopa or Pramipexole or some of these drugs at bedtime, those drugs will tend to promote vivid dreams. There are also people who act out their dreams. So there's having a vivid dream and then there's hitting somebody. And we refer to that as REM behavior disorder. So during the dream stage of sleep, you're supposed to be more or less paralyzed. So you dream all kinds of extravagant things, but you don't actually do them. That switch gets a little bit sticky in people with Parkinson's. So you may not be quite as paralyzed as you should be during your dream stage of sleep. And so people do varying degrees of talking or calling out or crying out, hitting or kicking. And then the most significant form would be somebody who actually gets out of bed and does very complicated things. So there are medications that we do sometimes use to simmer down the REM behavior disorder. Clonazepam is a drug we often use for that. But sometimes if people are just having vivid dreams, I may try to cut back on bedtime doses of Parkinson medicine. But sometimes people have vivid dreams even without any Parkinson medicine. So it's not really the fault of the drug. It may be more the disease in some people. Is vision affected by Parkinson's, and what do you do for that? To the extent that Parkinson's disease itself directly affects vision, my pills don't help. So I always suggest that people who have vision complaints go to the eye doctor and make sure you get your cataracts treated. Make sure you don't have glaucoma. Actually, levodopa can worsen glaucoma. So how it works chemically, it can affect some of the muscles that keep the fluids flowing in the eye. And if you block the flow of fluids in the eye, then you get increased pressure in the eye, which is what glaucoma is. So make sure you don't have glaucoma. And then it's amazing how much you actually rely on that film of tears and the oil over the tears to help focus light beams. And if your eyes are very dry, people will get this sort of non-specific blurring of vision. So make sure that the easiest thing in the world to do is keep your, or to try to do is keep your eyes well moistened. And then check in with the eye doctor, because Parkinson pills do not help any vision problems that may be due to Parkinson's. Are there medications to avoid when you have Parkinson's? That's also an excellent question. There are certain antipsychotic drugs. Haldol is kind of the most famous antipsychotic drug, been around for a long time. And all of the older antipsychotic drugs, how they work is by blocking dopamine in the brain. So the problem is there's two parts of the brain that use dopamine, one that has to do with movement and one that has to do with how you perceive things. People who have hallucinations have what seems like too much dopamine effect in the how you perceive things part of the brain. And so how do you treat hallucinations? You give a drug that blocks dopamine. The problem is we don't have a way to make the dopamine only go to the weird thoughts part of the brain without potentially going to the how you move part of the brain. So all of the dopamine blocking antipsychotic drugs could make Parkinson's worse, or could, part of some of those movies, the One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest, was if you give a normal person or a non-Parkinson person enough Haldol, they may end up looking like they have Parkinson's. And then the sneaky drugs that can actually block dopamine are some of the drugs they use for GI symptoms. So Reglan, which used to be used a lot as a treatment for ulcers, not used quite so much anymore, but that has anti-dopamine effects and can actually make the Parkinson symptoms worse. The anticholinergic drugs, again, I mentioned them earlier, can cause constipation, low blood pressure, confusion. We actually deliberately use anticholinergic drugs in some people with Parkinson's as a treatment for tremor. So anybody who's got tremor, predominant Parkinson's, may be taking a drug called trihexyphenidyl or Artane. That is an anticholinergic drug that we pull out of our pockets pretty much only when somebody has tremor as the big symptom. But we do it grudgingly, and we do it, we watch carefully for any of those side effects. And then, as I mentioned, we sometimes use anticholinergic drugs to treat the bladder troubles, the overactive bladder in people with Parkinson's. But again, we do it carefully and thoughtfully, and probably the first drug I stop in people with Parkinson's if they're having confusion would be their bladder medicine. What about medicine for drooling? There are drugs to treat drooling, and those are also anticholinergic drugs. So it might be that bladder drug you're taking will also help to dry up the saliva a little bit, but it's also possible that the drug I use to treat your drooling can cause constipation, trouble starting the urine, low blood pressure, and confusion. So we do sometimes use drugs to treat drooling. I often use a drug called Robinol. Sometimes we use a drug called atropine, actually a drug they sometimes use for eyes. We sometimes use this atropine drop under the tongue to dry up the saliva. It doesn't taste very good. It wasn't designed to be used under the tongue, but it does sometimes help to simmer down the saliva. And then the other treatment would be Botox injections into the salivary glands. Again, we reserve that for people who you look at the person and the shirt is wet, or they're wearing a protector all the time because they're just sort of gushing excess saliva. Most people with Parkinson's who are concerned about drooling, they're not really producing extra saliva. It's more that they're failing to swallow as frequently. And if I sit here with my head hanging down because I got Parkinson's and my mouth hanging open and I don't swallow, just like I'm not blinking very much, after a while, I'm going to start to drool. And so a cheaper treatment for drooling and Parkinson's is suck on a lemon drop, sugar-free. And by sucking on a lemon drop, it reminds you to shut your mouth. And it reminds you to do something with your mouth, and it reminds you to swallow. And oftentimes the tart lemon drop will make you secrete a more liquidy saliva. Or the other thing some people do is chew gum. Same idea, you close your mouth and you do something and it reminds you to swallow. So for some people, those actually work as effectively and with a lot less side effects than a bunch of pills for excess saliva. So, and I haven't been, Erin, do you have other questions that have?
Yes, I have a few more as our time is coming up on the end, but a couple of questions that have been submitted about marijuana or CBD oil for Parkinson's.
Yep. So there's a lot of enthusiasm and interest and questions in the patient community about CBD oil. I will admit to a slight, I think of myself as being usually kind of neutral. I'm neutral to slightly negative about CBD. What about medical marijuana? So in Minnesota, they've made medical marijuana easy. There's a list of conditions for which medical marijuana can be prescribed, and Parkinson's is not on the list. So the docs, the Parkinson specialists in Minnesota have zero experience using medical marijuana as a treatment for Parkinson's. CBD, in my view, is sort of riding the coattails of medical marijuana. It's kind of the latest herbal fad. It's out there, it's available. And what I suggest to people is, if you're going to go buy CBD oil, say out loud to somebody what symptom it is you're trying to treat. And I've had patients say, well, I want it for tremor. Somebody else says it's for stiffness. Somebody else says it's for sleep, it's for anxiety, it's for dyskinesia, it's for, for my appetite. So what symptom is it that you are specifically trying to treat? Say out loud to somebody what that is. Buy a bottle of it. And again, know that this is the reason it does anything in the body is because it's a drug. It's a chemical that does stuff. Take it according to whatever the instructions in the bottle are, not twice as much. And then at the end of the bottle, say out loud to whoever you were talking to, do you think it helped that symptom or not? And if you sleep better taking CBD, great. If you rub it on your muscles and you seem to have less cramps, terrific. But if it doesn't seem to help whatever symptom you were trying to treat, then you would stop taking it. And also understand that these herbal preparations are not manufactured to the FDA standards. So, Joe's CBD oil and some other company's CBD oil may not have quite the same stuff in them. And I can't tell you which brand of CBD to use. You would have to kind of figure that out on your own, but take it according to the instructions and know that it could do something bad for you, just like any other thing you take. Some people, strawberries don't agree with them. I love strawberries, but my daughter-in-law, I thought I was doing her a great favor having her help pick strawberries and make a strawberry thing. And she's like, yeah. Who knew?
Their own.
Yeah. So
all right, I have
Yep.
one last question for you. You mentioned so many drugs coming in the pipeline. With the new ones being introduced all the time, are there negative or unintended interactions with prescribing?
Yeah, so that's something that you sort of have to make sure you ask your doctor that question whenever they say, oh, here's a new drug, let's try this one. Ask the doctor, what do you know about this drug? And is it going to interact with any of the other things that I'm taking? And that's, one of the reasons to go to somebody who specializes in neurology or specializes in Parkinson's disease is that they're going to be a little bit more, interested or more likely to have reviewed the latest literature and to actually have as good an answer to that question as they can. That being said, we have limited experience. Anytime a drug is new, it's new. It's like a new, electric car comes out and you're like, well, they said it works, but, that was in a test situation under specific circumstances. And I don't know how an electric car is going to work in Minnesota where it's colder than it is in California. I don't know how a drug is going to work in somebody who's also taking diabetes medicine, heart pills, blood pressure pills, cholesterol pills, and everything else. So again, whenever you start a new drug, you also need to have an open line of communication back to the doctor to make sure that you haven't had some side effect from it, and let the doctor know if something bad happens. So I'll stop there because it's 11 o'clock.
Thank you so much. I feel like this is the tip of the iceberg. There's so much more discussion that we could share, but this has been a super helpful hour. So thank you so much, Dr. Nance, for your time today and sharing with our wonderful viewers. I'm so glad all of you were able to join us today as well. If we weren't able to get to your questions, we encourage you to reach out to the helpline, and they'll be able to help find some answers for you or direct you to some resources. We also greatly appreciate your feedback on today's program by completing the survey. This feedback you provide helps us plan for future programs. So you'll be getting an email most likely next week. So please share any thoughts you had. If the time of the day or the length of the program was off, please let us know. This follow-up email will also include the link with the recordings and the slides that are posted on our webpage and a few other resources. And also a reminder that you can join us weekly for virtual programs Monday, Wednesday, and Friday. To learn more and to register, visit parkinson.org/pdhealth. And you can also visit this page to view all the archive programs that we've had virtually since April. And lastly, a reminder, you're not alone. It was great to see so many faces on our program today. And please know you have support in our website, parkinson.org. Also reach out to our helpline to speak with a Parkinson's specialist. Until next time, stay well and happy holidays.